Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Clara
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on the gut microbiome and how it's linked to the brain.
And mental health.
Exactly. So, to start, what is the gut microbiome? It's a collection of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and viruses that colonize the gastrointestinal tract. And this is a huge part of what makes us, because the amount of genomic content that's carried by all of these microorganisms exceeds the human genome by over 100 times. So this genomic content is termed the microbiome. And a human body contains trillions of these microorganisms, which actually outnumbers human cells by 10 to 1. So in other words, we're made up more of microorganisms than of the cells that we would probably identify more with.
Which I guess is an individuality problem, which we mentioned in our very first episode.
Definitely, yeah. What makes us us, and can our microbiomes be considered an individual in itself? But these microorganisms, importantly, play a vital role in human health. And more research is showing the significance of the microbiome in mental health disorders, as well as psychiatric disorders, behavioural disorders, and neurodegenerative disorders. What I find really interesting about this is that the microbiome is like an intersect between the external world and our internal worlds, because it's a dynamic ecosystem, so it's constantly changing, and the composition of microorganisms depends on extrinsic factors like diet, of course, and also exposure to drugs, and intrinsic factors like our genetics or disorders, as I mentioned, as well as the interactions between microbes within it. This is something I wasn't aware of before. I only had a very vague picture of what the microbiome was, but I didn't realize that the functions of the microbiome rely on microbe-microbe interactions, and a single microbe can't carry it out by itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think not only the interactions between microbes within the same system is important, but also between systems. So there's a lot of studies about how in social environments, mixing the microbes and being around people with healthy microbes then encourage or facilitate the prevention of neurodegenerative disorders and etc.
Right, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought much about that.
Yeah.
Sharing microbes. It's like the link between humans then.
Yeah.
The bacteria that colonize our gut.
Yes, I think possibly if there hasn't been done, it could be done, some sort of social study on the identity of the gut microbiome and what that explains about our psychology and our social circles.
Yes, that would be such an interesting avenue to explore. So, as I mentioned, it has been determined that there is a link between the gut microbiome and neurodegenerative disorders, psychiatric disorders like depression or schizophrenia, and behavioural disorders like autism or ADHD. And also, the implications for this have been explored in terms of potential clinical treatments. But it's very difficult to establish any treatments targeting the microbiome, because the differences between individuals in terms of the composition of the microbiome seem to be exaggerated in diseases. So, for example, within a population of people with depression, their microbiomes tend to be more different than a population of non-depressed people.
Yes, and also I believe that there are issues with taxonomy and the identification and classification of the different microbes in the gut, because there's just such a vast amount that's also another issue when it comes to studying the microbiome and defining it.
Yeah, and I guess you can't really say any specific microorganism is good or bad, because as I mentioned, they act dynamically together.
However, there have been very promising studies linking the composition of the gut microbiome and several psychological avenues. So I have several examples. All of them came from FENS posters.
Oh, wow.
Yes. FENS is the Federation of European Neuroscience Society, and I was inspired to do this because they have the most up-to-date research since it was exposed to the public in July, and the microbiome research is very up and coming and it's very exciting. So this one studied by Oba on the hippocampal histoarchitecture and neurochemistry of psychologically stressed rats. They researched how psychological stress disrupts the gut microbiome and how it accelerates the decline in cognitive and memory functions associated with psychological stress. And so they hypothesized that administering probiotics could affect the neurochemistry of the hippocampus through the effect of the microbiome. And so they tested this, and what they found out was that yes, indeed, after treatments with probiotics, specifically units of Lactobacillus acidophilus, that the groups that received the probiotic treatment significantly showed better results in terms of the parameters assessed. And these parameters were the effect of serotonin and dopamine levels in the hippocampus. And in both acute and chronic stressed mice, they improved their conditions. And so that was quite promising and a gorgeous study in terms of linking the probiotic effect to the increase in psychological health by monitoring the hippocampus serotonin levels and through the psychological stress parameters.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think a really important consideration in terms of studies that address microbiome neuro interactions is establishing causality.
Yes.
So one of the most common ways that causality is established is by transplants of microbiota. And there have been several really, really interesting studies doing this. One related to anxiety. So in mice, they transplanted fecal microbiota from anxious mice. So these were mice that were subjected to something called chronic social defeat stress. So they're kind of bombarded with stress. And they transplanted their fecal microbiota into germ-free mice. And this resulted in an increase in an anhedonia-like phenotype, which means sort of a depressed phenotype in the recipients, as well as biologically, there was an increase in interleukin-6 in the plasma, and there was decreased expression of synaptic proteins in the prefrontal cortex. So this gives us some hints as to what might have caused the behavior. And so this is a great example of how the changes to the microbiome can directly induce anxious behavior.
Yes, that's such an interesting study. I also read another similar study, except instead of looking at anxiety, they looked at autism. And again, the same principle, they used a germ-free mouse as a model, and they did a fecal transplant of the microbiota of children with autism in germ-free mice. And it showed that the mice developed neurological and behavioral symptoms corresponding to autism spectrum disorder. So they analyzed this behavior and they showed a clear biochemical difference in the germ-free mice, and therefore correlating the microbial composition of autism spectrum disorder relating to the microbiota.
Right, and just to drive the point home, there's also another study by Sun et al. In 2018 that did the same thing in terms of Parkinson's disease, where they transplanted the gut microbiota from a mouse model of Parkinson's disease into the germ-free recipients, and this resulted in impaired motor function and decreased dopamine and serotonin levels in the striatum, which are all features of Parkinson's disease. So yeah, at the level of mental health and neurodevelopmental or behavioral disorders like autism and neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's, there does seem to be this causal effect, or at least it can be induced by changing the gut microbiota.
Yeah.
Which is just crazy because obviously as neuroscientists, you don't tend to think too far outside the nervous system, let alone brain. Although saying that, the gut-brain axis is also a huge component of the nervous system. So the gut is very connected to the brain, mainly via the famous vagal nerve. And the vagal fibers that innervate the gut, they don't directly interact with the microbiome because they don't cross the epithelium, the surface layer, but they can sense microbiota signals indirectly through their diffusion of metabolites from the bacteria. And the vagus nerve is connected to the brain stem and onwards to higher order brain areas. So this is thought to be a potential mechanism of how the microbiome interacts with the brain. And studies have also found that the depression-like or autism-like behavior can be rescued by instilling so-called good microbes, and this only occurs with an intact vagus nerve.
Oh, okay.
So without the vagus nerve, this doesn't happen, which suggests that these signals are transported via that ever so important nerve.
Yes. Yes, it's so interesting how all of these interactions within the gut, and it's like its own little ecosystem, and then they go across through the brain through this very important vagus nerve. It reminds me a little bit as well of mushrooms, and how they're this incredibly important component and glue and mediator within nature of getting the right components everywhere. And so I don't know.
And our gut is such an important form of communication with the world because it receives the food, which provides us energy. So it's like, it's like the brain's second navigator in the world, kind of sensing what is around us and what signals are we receiving.
Yeah.
Just like the fungi and the mycelium networks.
Absolutely. Yeah. The main difference is that the fungi digest their food through enzymes externally, whereas we ingest them and digest them internally.
Something else that I find really fascinating, I think this is an underrated fact. So serotonin is a major neurotransmitter, which is known as the happiness neurotransmitter because it tends to be associated with positive emotions and feelings of happiness. And there are some theories that the serotonin neurotransmitter systems are disrupted in mental health disorders like depression, although this is not the full story, but a major drug that has classically been used for depression, not always effective, but it's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so SSRIs. So the significance of serotonin is obvious, but it is estimated that actually 90% of the body's serotonin is made in the digestive tract.
Wow.
So it is not surprising that there is some link there between our mental state and our gut.
Yeah, I hadn't realized that. And yeah, it just emphasizes the importance of this gut-brain communication.
And linked to microbiomes, one of their major functions of these microorganisms is the production of a compound known as tryptophan. And tryptophan is a amino acid. It's derived from food, and it's essential for the synthesis of serotonin. So it's kind of the starting point of where serotonin is made from. And these reductions in tryptophan have been found in major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. So again, the link between tryptophan, the microbiome, converting that to serotonin, and that being produced in the gut, and then eventually transported to the brain.
Yes, and it's not only important in terms of creating the serotonin molecule and neurotransmitter, it also has impacts in terms of social interactions. As I mentioned in the beginning, there was this study regarding social isolation in adolescence and how the changes in gut microbiota influence hippocampal inflammation. So the primary author was Nicola Lopiso, once again another poster from FENS, and they did a study and they noticed that the changes in microbiota were especially significant in female mice, and that if they were isolated through a long period of time, there were changes in the gut microbiota which led to stress-related bacteria attacks, which were identified by LFC analysis. And the way that this was noted in the brain was a specific inflammatory pattern in the dorsal hippocampus, and they noted that this was highly correlated with the gut microbial composition. And so again, the exposure of the microbiota to each other in a community setting highlights the importance of social interaction, and how social interaction is not only good for, let's say, your psychological, emotional health, but clearly also your cognitive health and development.
That's so interesting. I wonder what actually caused the effects on the microbiome, though, from social isolation. Was there a change in diet, or could the brain itself then influence the microbiome as well through feelings of loneliness, or
like a bidirectional interaction?
Yeah.
If I were to speculate, I would speculate that from the bottom up point of view, let's say, from the gut to the brain,
Yeah.
I would estimate that perhaps it has to do something to do with variation. You know, we talk about how variation is so important for biological development, and perhaps this social isolation and this isolation of the gut microbiota isn't the healthiest. It's always in flux and it's a dynamic. So perhaps this is a negative signaling in that you're isolated. They identified these stress-related bacterial taxa. So maybe that has to do with perhaps some sort of like overabundance or overproduction of a specific type of bacteria, and
Because
you're not having that dynamic change.
Because of the stress of isolation.
Yeah, potentially. See, that was another one. So the top-down effect, let's say from the brain to the gut, which again, I'm speculating, potentially induces some sort of reaction, like, I don't know, like reactive oxygen species accumulation or some sort of neuroendocrine signaling that indicates that you're not in the healthiest environment.
Yeah, it's amazing how complex and abundant the number of signals that are happening within the microbiome and like the gut and the brain are. It's just the more research that's being done, we're simply just adding to that picture of how many interactions there are. Another really important role of the microbiome mechanistically is the immune pathways that it can stimulate or regulate. So the microbiome influences immunity through the interaction of products from these microbes with receptors within the gut to trigger the circulation of pro-inflammatory cytokines or cells. So, in other words, the gut can induce an inflammatory response via the microbiome. And this has been studied a lot in terms of neurodevelopment. So the microbiome of pregnant mothers seems to have an influence on the development of the child. And one such study looked in mice and found that a specific type of gut bacteria was able to prime a specific type of immune cells, CD4 positive T helper cells, in pregnant mice to elicit a pro-inflammatory response via the production of an interleukin. And this interleukin was transported to the meninges, or the surface of the brains of the developing baby mouse and can cause changes in the neurons there. And overall, this would increase the likelihood of the offspring developing neurodevelopmental disorders.
Wow.
So this again shows the significance of the microbiome between different humans, technically.
Yeah, absolutely.
In influencing neurodevelopment, which is so important in influencing everything else that happens later in your life. So research in the microbiome is increasingly important to understanding these developmental mechanisms.
Related to what you mentioned about immunity, I realized that there is also some research looking at autoimmune disorders, and that they are investigating whether probiotics aids or hinders in fighting autoimmune diseases due to the enhanced immune activity, etc. And actually, I just realized, like, looking through my notes, that the first study that I mentioned by Obaoyi on the psychologically stressed mice, that in his discussion, they talk about how the microbiome plays a significant role in hippocampal function because supplementing it mitigate stress-induced perturbations of hippocampal neurochemistry and redox status, which actually relates to what I was speculating about the socialization and what could be causing this increase in stress-related bacteria due to the social isolation.
So via redox chemical reactions?
Yes, exactly. Potentially there are some redox reactions happening in the hippocampus, which is inducing inflammation and all of these other related disorders.
Yeah. So I think something that's really interesting that's developing more, or at least trying to be, is the transplantation of microbiota for therapeutic potential in humans. But this very much remains in its infancy because the attempts have been small scale mainly, and also with much varied methodology. And the implementation of this is actually extremely challenging because, like, a lot of care needs to be done in terms of fecal transplants, because two different microbiomes might not be completely compatible. So it can actually cause damage if it's not done like extremely carefully, and if the microbiomes are not completely investigated before the transplant occurs.
I think that, as you mentioned, research in the microbiota, it does seem to still be very much in its infancy. I think that a couple things need to be a bit more consolidated before it can be launched widespread and draw really strong conclusions, which is the taxonomy, because there are still a lot of debates on the classification of the different microbes and viruses and within the gut. And then the second thing is being really careful about correlation versus causality. Because it's such a large system, because it involves not only the gut but the brain and the immune system and so many other systems, it's really hard to pinpoint what is the causality. So I think moving forward, really well-designed experiments and really well thought out scientific methods need to be carried out, but it sounds really promising, and clearly it touches on a lot of different developmental and neurodegenerative disorders, so it's really exciting.
Something we can't ignore as neuroscientists.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on that note, we'll end today's episode. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the episode. And do check out our website at neuroversecc.wixsite.com and our Twitter page. You can find us at neuroverse_pod.
We also have a Ko-Fi page where you can support our podcast if you like. We are aiming to use any donations to help improve the quality of the podcast episodes, namely the audio. And do email us if you have any ideas for episode topics. Thank you for listening.